This is the fifth lesson in chapter 10 on trigonometry, and last lesson we were looking at u-subs. I'd recommend pausing the video at this point, have a try on this question, and then in a few seconds after you've unpaused the video, I'll go through the solution. Now, the reason I chose this question is there's a few things that make this question more complicated. I've made some quite big limits here, which is unusual for questions we've done so far. I've gone with sine as well, which is typically a more complicated question. I've gone with a half x rather than 2x or 3x, which is more typical as well. And I've also added the plus 30 in as well, so I've added lots of different elements into this question. Now, the first thing we should do is we should make the question simpler by doing a u substitution. So instead of doing 0.5x plus 30, I'm just going to call that u. So the question becomes sine u equals 0.25. Now, if we change the question, we also need to change the limits as well. So our original limits here are 0 and 1,080. So if we substitute those x values into this formula here, we can find the u values. So 0.5 times 0 plus 30 is going to give us 30. If we plug 1,080 into here, a half of 1,080 is 540, plus 30 is 570. So our limits become between 30 and 570. Now we can go back and solve this question. So sine u equals 0.25, so do inverse sine or arc sine, whichever you prefer, of 0.25, and to the nearest degree, we're going to get 14 degrees. Now we can find the second one by using the symmetry of the graph. So this is basically what we're trying to look at here. Here's sine x. We're trying to find when it's equal to 0.25, probably a little high on my graph there. And we know that this value here is 14 degrees. Now we also know that this point here is 180 and this is 360. So the distance from the axis to that point is 14 degrees, which tells us that the distance from 180 to this point must also be 14 degrees. As it's to the left of 180, that means it must be 180 take away 14. So in other words, 166 degrees. Now you can check that answer on your calculator by doing sine of 166, and you should get something close to 0.25 if we allow for rounding. Once we've set up our question like this with the u-subs, add on 360, add on 360, as many times as we need to. I stopped here because we'd got above 570, and the same here, add 360, add 360. Once again, this is too high, so I've stopped. Also, we should subtract 360 from this value, but also that would be too low for this. And 14 is already below 30, so I don't need to subtract 360. So let's look which ones are between 30 and 570. So that one certainly isn't. That one looks good, that one's not, and that one's not either. So our answers are 166, 374, and 526. But there are u values. So if we go back and substitute into the original equation, or if we solve this for x, so subtract 30 from both sides, divide by half, dividing by half is the same as times it by 2, then we can find out what x equals, plug each of these u values into this formula, and we end up with our appropriate x values. As a final check at the end of the question, just make sure that these three values are indeed between 0 and 1,080.